Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Agri-Food Tech Innovation Forum. Today, we have a global audience attending remotely, many from the CGIAR, NARS, and other private and public organizations, all eager to learn about how science can be translated to impact. My name is Younghwa Lee, and I am a member of the Excellence in Breeding platform of the CGIAR, a group committed to the modernization of breeding programs supporting smallholder farmers with new seed varieties. It is my honor to moderate this discussion. Our forum today is entitled The Role of Venture Capital in Agricultural and Food Systems, Creating Opportunities and Scaling Up Science-Based Innovations. We are currently at a critical junction for securing a robust agri-food system in the era of rapid climate change and increasing world populations. Agriculture is already affected by global warming and extreme climate fluctuations. The decisions we make now will have repercussions for our children and our children's children for the security of the world they live in. We believe that progress is not a zero-sum game, largely due to the contributions of scientific research in creating new solutions and opportunities. Today, we gather to hear from a group of experts who are in this business of translating discoveries into sustainable, real-world, biodiversity-sensitive impact in a changing investment landscape. This unusually diverse collection of experience and expertise includes startup founders, representatives from multinational companies, venture capital firms, philanthropic organizations, and government. And here I would like to briefly pass the mic to JeanPierre Romenza, who led the effort to pull together this meeting of minds to introduce the forum.
And thanks, Younghwa, and hello everyone. Greetings from Rome. It is so exciting and inspiring to see such an incredible panel of great minds, all driven by the interest to create impact through innovation and to contribute to solving some of the most complex global challenges. The importance of scientific innovation in responding to the challenges related to agriculture, food and nutritional security, climate change, health, and biodiversity loss has never been greater and will only become more pressing in the coming years. While there is an interest in research solutions, there is still a gap between labs and market, and a lot of science-based solutions with a lot of market potential are stuck in a research paper or at the concept stage. There is definitely an untapped potential here, and a number of philanthropists, venture funds, and corporate actors could play a role through a cross-sectoral partnership and by investing to further develop products and de-risk innovative research that could redesign tomorrow's agricultural sector. Let me say that when we were first thinking about this session, we wanted to make sure that actors representing science and entrepreneurships and capital would be on the same stage to hear from each other and spark interest for further collaboration. I have no doubts that Today Forum deliver on all of this. For those of you online, this is an opportunity to learn, to get inspired, and to connect with like-minded peers and innovators. Let's hear from our stars today. So allow me to introduce our friend Roberto Viton, founder and managing director of Valoral Advisors, an international recognized advisory firms in the global food and agriculture investment space, and also partner at Yield Lab, a venture fund investing in accelerating high-impact early-stage companies around the world to sustainably revolutionize agri-food systems. Over to you, Rob.
Thank you so much, JeanPierre. Let me share my screen for a second. So I'm very glad to join in this innovation forum today. I'm joining from Luxembourg, where we run our investment advisory firm specialized in food and agriculture. But originally, I come from Argentina, where we have been farming with my family for many generations. So today I can say I am a farmer and advisor in this forum. And I would like to talk about this revolution that we have underway in food and ag innovation and the role of venture capital. So please join me to go through this presentation. So I think that we can all agree with this statement. After so many years of working in the food and ag industry, I really believe that this is one of the most important global sectors, and it's also poised for transformational changes in the decade ahead. And I think we all agree that we need to build more efficient and sustainable production systems where technology and technology innovation is paramount for achieving this. I think this is essentially showing the opportunities and the challenges we have in front of us. Let's talk about that. First of all, I really believe the food and ag space is fundamentally revolutionary. We can go back in time, we can go as far as we can think and see all the innovation and the technology developments that human beings have been developing over time to overcome many of the challenges. And we can come back to our dates and see how this innovation wave has continued. Well, the truth is that as we speak, we are living beyond the planetary boundaries. And this is something that we have to change now. I brought this chart from Kate Raworth. She is the author of Donut Economics. In case you haven't heard about her or you haven't read her work, I really suggest you look at it. And what you can see is that many of these ecological ceilings and ecological boundaries that we are trespassing in terms of land degradation, biodiversity loss, of course, all the impact climate change. These are major challenges that we are facing today, and we need to find a solution to them. That's why, once again, we need from technological innovation to help us solve these challenges. What I have included in this chart is a group of the 12 major innovation areas that we follow when we look at investments in the broad food and agri space. And one of the special characteristics of this technology innovation wave that we have is that it's really spanning all the food and ag value chain, because we are facing challenges everywhere. And moreover, COVID-19 has brought more challenges and is also triggering some of these innovation. As you know, COVID-19 has meant that we have tried to bring local production closer to consumers. We have also seen across the last year, the last 18 months, a lot of acceleration in automation and digitalization in many areas of the food and ag value chain. Of course, there is also increased scrutiny on food safety, and you can think all the innovations around traceability. And last but not least, the big elephant in the room, which is a new wave and renewed efforts on sustainability. And this is one of the key matters and topics to discuss today. I think the good news is that investors have been increasingly deploying capital in the broad food and agriculture investment space. For the last 10 years, we have been compiling data about investment funds specialized in food and agriculture. So here you can see an evolution in the number of these funds as far as 2005 till now. Well, I think that the growth that you see there is massive, but what I would like to emphasize today is the key pillars in terms of investments. What you can see, first of all, is farmland, which means all the primary production. Second, private equity, which are all these investments essentially in the food and ag value chain. And last, all the venture capital investments, which are going into agri-food tech innovation. So you can see the number of investment funds specialized in all these asset strategies. Now, for me, this is the big question. This is great. All this investment is coming to this space, but are we doing it in the right way? Do we think that we are channeling that capital in the most effective way to spark all this innovation, to bring it to the market? Well, some people may see the glass half empty, others may see the glass half full. I think that in any case, what I look forward in these coming sessions and during this week is to listen and learn from each other and find out how we can speed up technology development and how we can speed up the adoption of this technology. One of the last messages I would like to leave you today is about the importance of local ecosystems. So this is the question that we try to ask every day. How can we foster innovation in the most effective way? This is a simple illustration of how a local ecosystem could look like, with startups, which are the talent, the entrepreneurs at the heart of this ecosystem. And then all the other stakeholders that are needed for this ecosystem to thrive and to accelerate the development of technology, of innovation. There is clear evidence that local ecosystems are a major driver for innovation. And we have seen this in many places. In fact, what I'm sharing here with you right now is a map of over 3,000 agri-food tech companies in Europe. This is a mapping that we have been doing for the last year, and you can see the breakdown of these companies, of these teams by country. But for me, the key message is most of these startups have been born in local ecosystems. Many of these startups have been able to scale up thanks to these local ecosystems. I could say that 5 years ago, there were not even half of these startups in the market. And this is very important because all these teams of entrepreneurs, all of them are solving some of the challenges we spoke about before. So we really need to help them. Well, how can we help them? How can we help also other scientists? So these are some of the questions that I look forward to finding solutions in the next coming sessions. The last message from my side is really that we need to talk more. I think that all these stakeholders, we need to look through the eyes of each of them. I think that we need more conversations. When you look at this picture, you can look at those farmers, and we can go back to the challenges and say, hey, many of the challenges we're facing are deeply connected to what happens in the farms. So a good way to work on this, to accelerate innovation, to accelerate technology adoption, is to talk more to farmers as well. More than that, I really look forward also to having more conversations with you in the next coming sessions and throughout this week. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you very much, Roberto, for those remarks. I would at this time like to introduce our panel. Okay, so first off, we have Bruno Basso. He is the co-founder of Cibo Technologies, a flagship pioneering venture that models regenerative ag systems for grower profit. We also have Dorothy Shaver, Global Marketing Sustainability Lead at Knorr, which is Unilever's largest food brand. We have Ahmad Bahalim, Senior Program Officer in Agricultural Development at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Barry Goldman, Founder and Chief Science Officer at futonbio, a startup focused on mining microbial communities for new innovations. We have Edward Perello, Associate Director of Agriculture, Deep Science Ventures, a venture capital firm. Ennis Olson, Global Innovation Lead, Food at Google, which is a living laboratory for food system innovations. Alizé de Tonac, CEO and co-founder of SeedStars, a venture capital firm. Liana Logoriato, ex-partner of strategy and transactions at Ernst & Young. We have Atanasia Atanasiou, a senior researcher at GreenTech, which is a nanotechnology research unit at the Italian Institute of Technology. And finally, Mark Durno, managing partner of AgriFoods at Rockstart, a venture capital firm. We will be conducting the forum talk show style with questions directed towards panel members. I would like to remind the speakers to keep your responses to within 2 minutes. And if you would like to comment on a fellow panel member's remarks, please raise your hand in the Zoom. While we will not be taking audience questions directly, I invite the audience to exchange ideas on the chat, invite people to connect and get the full benefit out of this event. So today, let's dive into our discussion on the role of venture capital in agri-food innovations. Our forum will be organized in 3 stages: sourcing talent and scientific discoveries, scaling the science with the investment of capital, and impact via adoption in the market. So, all right, so our first section, let's talk about the incredibly rich landscape of technology and innovation that we are currently operating in. Specifically, we would like to discuss how we can source talent and knowledge early and support it through challenges. So my first question goes to Edward of Deep Science Ventures. Edward, what are new discoveries coming out of food and agricultural research? And how is high tech and deep science being integrated into these food and ag innovations?
Great question, thank you. So I guess the challenge with the way this question is composed is, we're sitting here on a forum of venture capital folks. So anything that's new is fundamentally opaque to us, as what is new right now is being developed in the research centers, institutions, and universities at the moment. And unless we have a direct route into that basic science, it's not something that groups operating in the financial world tend to see in their day-to-day business. So, I was working in startups 5 years ago. I had my own company, and I'm very much biased towards looking at things that are about modification of existing biological systems. For that reason, I tend to look at genome engineering, CRISPR, the other RNA-guided nucleases and meganucleases of that period as being new, in the sense that companies that adopted that technology and bet everything on it are now coming to the foreground today. So Plant Edit, Pairwise, Hudson River, these are coming, Caribou even, right? Companies that raised bullishly a long time ago, but are now starting to have impact in the market. The other area that I think about, if you sort of take a step back, it's not just about modifying a particular organism, but also looking at interactions between organisms, right? Systems of organisms in the biological or ecology systems that define agriculture. And for that reason, I look a lot at the microbiome as one of the areas where we sort of leapt beyond what you've seen in a human microbiological understanding and more towards how it can be leveraged in both plants. You see Join, you see Pivot, but increasingly in animals as well. So there's Volta Green Tech in Sweden, which I think recently closed a small round to look at the use of seaweed as a bioadditive to modify methane emissions from ruminants. Really, really exciting way to think about things. You're leveraging not just a modification of an existing bacteria, but how these things operate with an actual organism. You're getting to quite complex interactions, which I think is hugely exciting. But we shouldn't also disregard the utility of applying data systems to those kinds of analysis. You can't get a useful innovation to market unless you're looking at all of these things together, in my opinion. Either you're modifying a biological system and measuring that, or you're modifying lots of systems together and measuring that to come up with your best algorithm. How do you deploy this technology?
Thank you, Edward. And this is actually a really great segue into our next question, which is about how we get scientific discoveries out of the laboratory. And we happen to have 2 startup representatives on the panel, both of whom work on systems at different levels. So maybe next I'll direct the question first to Barry from futonbio. How do we get the latest scientific innovations out of the lab and into the market?
Thank you, Yanghua. Yeah, so Barry Goldman, futonbio. We are a startup that tries to bring microbiomes to new technologies. And how we think about it is to isolate groups of microbes. And our first product is to bring microbes to the soil to remove carbon dioxide from the soil and improve plant health. So it's a soil health while removing carbon dioxide. That's what we're focusing on. But how do you get out there? You have to scale. You have to figure out, how do you grow these things? How do you deal with whatever regulatory agencies you have to deal with? And you have to think about it in a very broad way, as well as thinking about how to get to market. So it's a very complex stream with many steps along the way where you can fail at many of the steps. So to do that, you need enough backing from capital to be able to enable that. And so we think we focus on all the steps and figure out where we can fail, how we succeed, and how do we make sure we can stay in business until we get to that step.
Right. Bruno, could I ask you the same question?
Surely. Well, I'm a scientist, and I navigate both spaces, you know, the university research innovation, as well as the opportunity to be a chief scientist at Cibo Technologies. And I share the thought that scalability is a critical piece when we develop, novel breakthroughs, because in addition, to the money needed to scale, the technology needs to be designed with the purposes of solving problem across, a very complex sets of interactions. And Cibo Technologies focuses on capturing those interactions, but not necessarily depending on input data, which often either are missing or of lower quality, but trying to generate through a system approach this interaction. I encourage the venture capitalists in the room to visit more frequently or learn more about what happens in the universities, because there is quite a bit of work going on in terms of innovation, but there is also, unfortunately, a feeling that scientists are still less, they're more sensitive of, having this technology go for a commercial sorts of use. And I don't know why there is that. I had this privilege to work with Flagship pioneering, and I've learned a huge amount to be able to see the research applied. It's the dream of any scientist. So there needs to be more of that interaction, and again, looking at possibility of scaling to be truly successful.
I guess this maybe goes back to like Bruno or Edward. What are there what are the channels for a university researcher to connect to venture capital?
I guess I could start, since I went through that process. I had the privilege through my lab and to develop this novel digital platform, and Flagship pioneering was actually looking for similar system approach and scalable, but we did not know each other. So it was the office at MSU Technology that I had to reach out, because of, the knowing that I felt that something was going to be useful. And so it's through the innovation offices and technology, which often nowadays they are organizing events to break this, this wall between, the public science and eventually providing a solution. So there is in each university, there is an office, but I also encourage, venture capital to be more present and be able to, share their visions through seminars or webinars through the university, because a lot of young scientists are indeed interested in seeing the research applied.
Mm-hmm. Oh, could you briefly explain Flagship pioneering to the audience?
So Flagship pioneering is very interesting. Is a venture capital firm out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Obviously got popularity because it's the main owner of Moderna. Has invested in the life cycle, in the life sciences across several other companies like Indigo, Ag, InBio, Cibo Technologies, Inari. And their way of investing is slightly different. They see the technology, but they start a company through venture labs. So it's basically investing in continuing the R&D instead of having these competitive grants. They really focus on, that particular technology. So a company is started, and then it's basically decided if it goes through the next streams of A, B, C, and so on. But I really enjoyed, and I had to select between different opportunities, and that model really did the trick for me.
Okay. And one thing you seem to be emphasizing is that the scientist needs to have sort of an entrepreneurial mindset and go looking for those opportunities.
For sure, I was in the same way, and I'm now learning how critical it is to see you can write as many Nature papers, it doesn't make a dent. unless you really start seeing the research applied and solving problem and all the challenges that we see. I mean, there is just no question about the science has to be taken to the next level to really solve problems.
Thank you. Alize, I'd like to ask you, how is this sort of interaction of getting the science out of the lab same or different in a developing context?
Yeah, so we exclusively invest in emerging markets, and our fund is industry agnostic. So ag tech, if I may say so, is only a percentage of our portfolio, but having already invested in Africa or South Asia on this topic, because we're early stage investors, and at that time when we launched the first fund, we hadn't included the kind of incubation fund or venture lab model that Barry just presented. We had to focus on already existing enterprise that had some level of traction, and in that space, we went quickly towards the ag tech companies that were looking at the whole value chain. So either in the financing schemes for the farmers or the marketplace for the sales, or the kind of rethinking the processes with some level of IoT. So we never had to necessarily, we didn't have portfolio companies that were working very closely with universities or scientists at that stage. Sometimes they were taking in intel, but that bridge definitely is missing. And we don't see it only in agriculture. I think life science has been done so well because the process of financial incentives, which is unfortunately still what a lot of the different ecosystem players have to present themselves with in terms of success, is much more well defined in the pharmaceutical world. But we see it in education, unbelievable research that we're not able to plug in the growth stage ventures that we invest in. And so that definitely is a big topic. And our reaction to that on how we wanted to participate in providing a more systemic change in this pipeline issue is we are now working on incubation funds. So we are together with wannabe entrepreneurs or already entrepreneurs in these markets, so really from Latin America to Asia to Africa, defining with these, with also labs, maybe university labs or other kind of data-oriented labs that we have in-house, how can we build from scratch ventures that are really going to tackle some of these challenges that aren't sexy enough, that aren't bankable enough, that are too complex in the bridge to look into. And that's where hopefully we can really talk about land restoration at scale, this whole circular economy at scale, which are topics that are very important to us.
Thank you, Alice. Maybe a little bit of a different perspective on the question. Ahmad from the Gates Foundation. What are the kinds of sources of funding that we can leverage for this transition in a developing context?
Thanks for the question. It's quite relevant to the discussion, especially to the way that Roberto laid things out in his final slide. You know, we're dealing with a diverse set of stakeholders, very different contexts, but very common outcome that we're driving towards. I guess the way that I would probably suggest reframing the question, repositioning it is to encourage us to think of this as a system or a spectrum of different kinds of funding at different stages that then have different sources. So I work for a philanthropy, and the kind of capital that we provide is grant capital in general, and generally speaking, with nonprofit aims. And if that's the case, that's largely often sort of upstream. And that's generally the role that, say, the public purse plays. So your normal public funding agencies, including the resources that, for example, the CGIAR receives. Now that has an important role in moving the entire curve of innovation as we think about it. But then there's that middle zone where you have venture capitalists, you have incubators at universities, you have a very diverse set of actors and funders. And very often we don't connect the two very well. So the public transition to, say, providing funding for something that's going towards market is quite poor, I'd say, in the ag tech world in general. There are better lessons or better models in other aspects of tech that have been pretty successful. And then where we take, say, your early stage capital to then actually make things come to market, say through large cap firms, that even is also a weak link. So is there some way where we could pull all these pieces together rather than just provided or even seek funding in silos? So that would be a question that I would have for the community, and maybe a slightly different way to think about this problem. Back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm sure that got a lot of thoughts going for maybe some of the venture capital folks in the room. Mark, could I ask you to comment on what Ahmad was just talking about, the system of funding and how to make sure the right connections are made at the transitions between public to scaling?
Yeah, I think the point I picked up on there that was top of my mind for this as well was that intersection and how the community actually merges or interacts and collaborates with one another. We find there are so many overlapping efforts and activities that some areas are somewhat oversubscribed, like, for example, incubation is a good example, whether you get it publicly through a corporate, through a VC fund, through a private investor who's looking to step on. That space is huge. If you want support there, there's enough to be done. Why not look on the peripheries of that and see where there can be more collaboration? And for me, this comes down to the word ecosystem gets used quite a lot. What that actually means in this context is community. So being able to tap into a community means being able to be part of something that's bigger than your individual effort or your organization's individual effort in the transformation, for example. And by just participating, not expecting anything else, you will find where your contributing factor is. And that's the same thing goes for researchers and for startups alike. Participate in the community that is closest to the goal or the ambition that you have, and you'll be able to tie together, like Ahmad and I haven't had a chance to meet prior to this, but by being part of this community, we get to have a conversation about it. So I think that's my reaction to this very good point, is try and seek out the complementary stakeholders and actors in the space. And before you know it, you're going to have a pathway or a map to be able to scale whatever impact or solution it is that you're working on. Right,
thank you. Liana, could I ask you to comment also on this ecosystem of funders and companies?
Yeah, look, let me say that there are a couple of ways of interacting here, two different clusters of investors and corporate business players into the space. There are the ones that are proactive and the other ones that are a little bit more sitting and waiting and reactive, okay? With the difference that actually the ones that are proactive are really on the front foot and getting out there and searching. The other ones are waiting for others, that could be intermediaries or companies that targets springing up and going directly, okay? The implication of this is that actually on the side of the startups and these nascent businesses, it's also up to them to spring up and raise the flag, raise the bar in terms of visibility and getting out. And I tell you, we're hugely facilitated these days. You just need to jump on a Zoom call, okay? You can actually speak with people at 10, 20,000 miles away, okay? And by the same token, there are some platforms that are actually running, okay? And corporates can actually be on those platforms, okay? There are conferences all over the places, okay? So people can raise their voice and their flag, okay? And become visible, okay? And then having said that, you know, there are the old ways of getting into conferences as well as on the target lists of investment banks of any type. So being the ones doing the capital raisings or the ones that are actually doing the tracking for the M&A targets, so that actually that visibility is enhanced, okay? And clearly, every single time one of these companies is going through capital raisings, okay, doing a seed round of financing, then a first round, second round, and then going third and fifth pre-IPO, it's very important that the communication is actually out there with a clear sense of purpose and mission, why the company is there, what's the vision of the thing, and also an overall story with a good investment case, because ultimately any company needs to be surviving the test of being bankable, having a bankable investment case. Okay, so it's a lot in the initiative of not only of who's scouting for opportunities, but also of companies that wanted to be scouted for and being on the radar screen of whoever, being capital raisers or the principals directly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Liana. I'm gonna bring it back to Edward to maybe like touch back on this idea of visibility and gaining visibility for your company or your innovations or your research idea. Edward?
I think one of the challenges with visibility for any scientist is figuring out what to look at and what to talk about. And I think if you look at the PhD system, the academic system in general, we tend to think about it as occurring before finance or venture capital or the development of a startup. And our traditional way of looking at this is to be obsessed with technology transfer and to assume that a scientist who had a good research question has also asked a good commercial question. And that's not always the case. There may be a good business in what they're doing if they're trying to create a solution to a particular problem, and that's guided their research question initially. But if they're a biologist and they only know biology, then they are going to see everything as having a biological solution. And oftentimes that removes the ability of that individual to assess other domains, whether it's chemistry or geology or engineering or something completely different, to go and create a new technology solving the same problem in a different way. And when you have to go through a tech transfer system in order to then generate a company, you may not always generate the best company possible that way. And particularly in the UK, where there are differences on IP ownership by university, it means that the company may actually then be dragging along a challenging cap table for external investors, making it even less interesting for an investor to look at that moment. So I kind of think in order for science entrepreneurs to get the most visibility, they need to be going to completely different domains inside and outside of universities, talking to investors even before they start their research, if they do want to start a business. And that like the future really is about targeted R&D with venture building in mind, rather than adding a venture building layer to a research question subsequently.
Thank you. Okay. To start to close this session, I'm going to direct the next question to Enes, where he runs Food and Google, which is sort of a living lab for different food innovations. Enes, could you tell us about some technologies that you think are disrupting current systems and to what effect?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think when we look at disruptive technologies, building on some of the comments some of the other panelists have shared, particularly what Edward just shared, often we find people who have found a specific solution with a goal in mind for that solution, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's really been designed for, as others have mentioned, the system itself or the ecosystem within the value chain. So I think it's important when you look at the technologies to think about what part of the value chain are they solving, and does it easily connect into the other parts of that value chain. So some of the technologies we've looked at recently, one that we've even been able to help through some funding is full cycle bioplastics. So being able to take any organic waste and turn that into a food safe PLA material. And in doing that, we looked at what were they solving for within the market, and versus us trying to invest, we were able to provide some funding to actually demonstrate the technology that they had built, which then made it easier for them to get the investments they needed. So we, really look at the technologies and what stage they're in, and can we apply them directly within our own environment, or can we invest in others? So the technologies that really stand out for us then are really at farther down in the value chain, looking at CPG and packaged goods. How do we actually deliver in a global supply chain food that isn't reliant on plastic? And then the other is looking at ingredients in back of house. So as large kitchens, think about all of the ghost kitchens and delivery systems that have started up. You're ordering any number of ingredients, whether it's fresh produce or shelf-stable goods, they're also in plastic, right? So when we think about circularity, we're looking for technologies that are actually deep within that value chain. And what's not obvious is we need to look at it right where it's being consumed, but then trace it all the way back to upstream where those things are happening. And that's why, full cycle bioplastics was interesting to us, right? So we've been looking at technologies that solve for that downstream impact, but are doing it further upstream in the value chain.
Thank you. Okay, so I think it's probably time to move on to our second section, which is about scaling these innovations. So the promise of science and research to change the game is undeniable, but how do we take that promise and realize it into a product? This one goes to Edward, Deep Science Ventures. How does the nature of food and agtech innovation, which involves our long R&D cycles in a regulation-heavy environment, complicate funding?
I'll try and keep it simple, significantly. But it all really comes down to the regulatory element being the hurdle to accessing a particular market and whether or not a fund wants to get involved in backing that particular company as well. And the way that this could be conducted most reliably is assuming that you do want to make an investment in a particular product because you like the team, you like the company, you think that that market is going to grow. The question is, can I get that through the regulatory barrier? And then how large is the market size and how valuable is that company? You can then take a bet, if you wish, on whether or not regulations will change going forward. And then you're just really modeling best case to worst case scenarios on market access for that company. One of the things I would say that complicates this is if you're working with an entirely novel technology and you're really at the coalface of innovation, then the regulatory system that does exist could be totally inappropriate for the new product or technology or service that's being developed, in which case then you do have to take a position early on in whether or not you're going to back that company. And if you think that either a regulatory system will change to adopt that, and it could take decades, or it will sort of skirt through that regulatory system, as you've seen with genome engineering in some jurisdictions, allowing rapid market access.
Right, thank you. Anastasia, could I ask you, what are some of the growing pains that you've had in transitioning discovery from your research into a marketable innovation?
Okay, actually, there are many things that are going on at the moment in the labs, and it's true that what the other people said before, that it's a dream for the scientists to get out of the laboratory. It's true that in the Italian Institute of Technology, where I'm working, we have created many startups. But at the same time, we directly collaborate with corporates. So basically, we collaborate in the sense that we make research for them, sponsored research, but also even more interesting for us, we make joint laboratories. So we make R&D for different corporates in our labs, or we bring some of our scientists there. And this really gave us a lot of feedback because we really understand what the market needs because we are in the companies. And concerning the thing we are talking about today, the agriculture and the agrotech and everything, what we did, it was another step forward, I think, towards the market, that it was quite important for the scientists. We started collaborating between us, first of all. So what it was mentioned before that some of us, I'm a material scientist, okay? I see everything from the point of view of materials. For example, how to recycle the agrofood waste into new bioplastics. But I started collaborating with the other scientists, for example, with the robotics, okay? The robotics people, they had some robots that they were ready to be in the field every day and monitor the crops, for example. I started collaborating with engineers that were making sensors, and they could sense where we are, at what stage is the food, at what stage is the fruit. And all this, we try to put together things to collaborate in the sense that I am not thinking only to bring bioplastics in the market for food packaging, that this is something that we all know that is needed, but I'm even thinking of bringing these bioplastics to make new sensors and create green electronics, okay, or to have fantastic grip to the robots that they are moving. All this, putting this together, I think it creates so many opportunities, and it gives us also to ourselves, the scientists, another point of view that we can go and really bring new things to the market, things that they are not there, things that nobody has thought, but at the same time, because we bring together our know-how, that they have TRL quite high to be close to the market. So this is where we are at the moment.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Anastasia. So I'm gonna maybe bounce off of Anastasia's comments and go to Enis. So Anastasia was describing some innovation models that really heavily rely on collaboration and participation in different disciplines. What can food and ag tech startups learn from examples of innovation models in other sectors?
Yeah, there are so many different ways to approach disruption and innovation and new technologies. But I think much to some of the earlier points around the business idea versus the research itself is understanding what the different business models can do. And I think what we're seeing, particularly within agriculture and food more broadly, is a need to disrupt some of those models. And to the comment about regulatory frameworks, the food industry has so much regulation that in doing this, you might need to actually contradict some of those. And this is where I think partnership comes into play. It's one thing to have a technology that you can say, look, the regulatory framework doesn't support this today, but if we do this and all of these things fall in place, look at what we'll be able to do. So we need funding to get this off the ground. Another way to approach it, though, is to actually look at the ecosystem and say, who in the value chain can I partner with, so that when we approach this, we're not saying it's just us trying to create this new technology and looking at that business model, but our business model is one that's inherently linked into the value chain so that we can actually show real value more quickly, that it can actually start to shift policy. And I think that's actually something that's appreciated within the food industry.
Thank you. Barry, I feel like you might have sort of a real world example of what Enis was just talking about. Could I ask you about that?
Yeah, thank you. So no, that's exactly right. And we focused entirely on working with a large ag company to help bring our products forward. They gave us some non-dilutive funding to it was kind of a bit of a wild idea, but they funded us to try this in the lab, and now we have to try and move this to the field. And without testing in the field, without a regulatory framework, you can't move it forward. And so right now we're working with this large group that has enabled us to move it forward, to get access to their regulatory groups, to give us feedback on how we think about it and how to reframe our question. And so we've been working with these strategics to take it to that next level.
Mm-hmm. Bruno, do you also have an example that you could touch on? Your company is a bit different in terms of it's focused more on data and modeling, but there's also lots of regulation around data.
Indeed. I mean, the system approach plays this critical role of integrating different components, so it's designed to scale quickly, but at the same time, the monitoring, reporting, and verifying, especially in the context of sequestering carbon and quantifying ecosystem services across the scale, is correctly imposing some level of reorganization of the whole idea. And SIPO in particular is working closely with different protocols to be able to ensure that this quantification needs to be real. And as you know, there are so many uncertainties in measuring and comparing laboratory measurements or even testing models. So protocols play a critical role, that we bring the transparency that is needed. But at the same time, I still need to underline the system approach, because it gives the possibility of scaling quickly and partnering with companies that they could ask questions, mainly the CPGs. That's what we've been working as a model of collaboration. be able to recruit and learn where a certain level of sequestration or good practices was coming from rather than another place. So the trial and error, obviously, it's not the way to be able to do so when you scale, and collaboration and be able to have transparent rules is key for sure.
Thank you. Mark, from the venture capital side of things, what do you see in terms of startups taking new paths to acquire new technologies and commercialize them?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one. Maybe I just want to quickly touch on and add to what was discussed there about regulatory aspects coming from a VC perspective. And there, I think of our portfolio companies, the ones that we're most impressed with are those researchers who are behind the product, and they go out and investigate the market and make it very simple to understand what that regulatory landscape looks like and what the pathway is. So we've got one example of a Turkish company just now. We're using active plants, ingredients, and biomolecules. They've been able to identify Spain and the UK as their target markets. It's going to take, we know it'll take 2 years to get through regulatory for that application, but they're already on the ground there. They're already working with farmers, etc. So to the researchers out there who would like to take an entrepreneurial route, back to Nasia's very good point, be proactive. Take the first step. And that kind of goes for what we see here in terms of startups looking towards, I'm going to reframe, or maybe my reaction to your question is a little bit different, Young, because what we, as a VC, what we would, and especially an early stage VC, what we would rather see are the researchers, the owners of the technological vision, being the ones to take that forward to the market. All too often we come to a startup where you've got you perhaps have a lead in place who's got commercial experience, which is essential because it helps you in terms of getting to that scalability and understanding your market application. But that they've gone out and somehow acquired a piece of technology or acquired a particular license, and they then want to scale that up. What we would rather see is a combination of that commercial acumen and that research background, having a joint vision for how they're going to take that forward in terms of transformation. So to kind of, in reaction to your question, I would say it's not so much about startups going and finding the researchers and then taking that forward. It's more about researchers finding the commercial counterparts that can help them to bring their research or their technology towards application. And maybe just to round that point off, the way in which to do that is back to the previous comment we discussed, which is based around communities, ecosystems, and tapping into the various different stakeholders. That is, if you've got a very rich, diverse stakeholder network, especially if you've got a few trusted parties that you work with that can bring you to that relevant stakeholder network with the right domain expertise and access, we've seen it in practice really speed things up and things can go quicker. Yeah.
Thank you. Dorothy, could you comment on specifically like partnerships with private industry and public research institutions, and how those sort of partnerships can help for commercial agri-food impacts?
Sure. So at Unilever, we actually partner across a variety of different types, sizes, and ways of partnering. So some of our partnerships are really large, some of them are relatively smaller. Recently, we kicked off the regenerative agriculture principles, for which we want to implement them. And for those, we will need to work with small and large partners from both the agri-tech industry and also expertise in the space of farming. What we've found through these partnerships is that we really need to work together across the industry with very, very small startups and also, of course, academics to enable our farmers and our suppliers to actually monitor their impact themselves. So something that we're really looking at now is how do we really implement different monitoring systems at the farm level so that our farmers can actually look and say, look across the whole value chain, where have we used a lot of water? Where have we, where have we put in too much pesticides or chemicals, or where have we done tillage in a space where we haven't, so that they can really see their impact across their whole kind of value chain. So that's a big space for partnership, and I think a huge opportunity for agri-tech partnerships, small and large. And we're also working with academics in this space to really see how can we monitor, not just monitor, but also report back on the impact because the way that we're going to be able to scale up any of these, fabulous principles or ways of doing agriculture is if we monitor them and really show the impact on the end to say, when we did X, it actually did increase species below and above ground. When we did X, it actually did do this. And that's actually the way that we'll be able to scale up as well, right? So we can implement principles, we can take something from the lab and put it on the field. But the real way we'll be able to scale it up is if we are able to somehow, and I know this is controversial, commercialize or standardize these practices and these principles and these way of doing things, so we can scale them up. And the way to get there is to utilize technology for monitoring and impact reporting. So those are the key areas, kind of from the agri-tech perspective, that I have experience with working with partners, and it's been extremely useful. But as a cry for help, we do need to do quite a bit more. So we have 50 projects that we intend to launch over the next 5 years that implement regenerative agriculture principles and experiment with different ways of agriculture. And we really do need to partner with private banks and private industries and private little areas of investors, and we need to really work all together, I think, across the whole value chain to really see how we can make an impact and partner for scale.
Thank you, Dorothy. Mark, do you have a comment?
Yeah, Dorothy, I just want to back up your comment there on, I don't think it's controversial at all that we say that these need to be commercial applications. As a farmer from background, the big challenge that I have in our farming community is that and when it comes to regen farming, which is also a focus for us at Rockstart, is them saying, how do we do this in terms of actions? And how do we make sure that the bottom line actually works out here? Because remember, the farmers are working on very, very thin margins. So completely back up that comment on behalf of anybody who's sat in a tractor at some point in their life there. Thanks.
Thank you. Liana, could you also comment on how partnership with private industry and public research can perhaps help negotiate IP, et cetera, for commercialization?
Yeah, look, I mean, this scaling up is very fundamental, okay? Especially considering what is the structure of the capital markets in relation to this specific space, okay? But let me park it for the moment, this piece, okay? So the fact that the startups, these new tech players are stepping into partnerships helps with the validation of the business model. It helps for the acceleration of the booking of revenues, as well as accelerating also the profitable growth for the business, okay? And considering that some of the industrial players in the space are very focused on their own profitability, they've been cutting substantially their R&D, okay? So if the tech player has actually got the formula, the business, a nice business model, something that is innovation, having the licensing opportunity or the commercial partnership actually enables the larger players to get an earlier sight of what is coming and potentially fund these opportunities and potentially also acquiring these businesses. So it's a path to the acceleration, okay? I like to open brackets around the point around the related capital markets for this space, okay? It was great at the beginning, in the first 5 minutes, when we looked into a chart that was actually showing a nice progression of the funding environment, okay? But if I'm comparing that amount of funding and that progression to what I've experienced myself before stepping in agriculture, I've been heavily into tech, okay? The sheer amount of what goes in for venture capital and private equity for the tech, the high tech, really makes the figures we're seeing now in agriculture, unfortunately, a little bit laughable, okay? And the other thing that I like to raise is that there is a bit of money from private equity. There is a bit of money from venture capital, okay? Nothing compared to what goes in other industries, unfortunately. But on top of this, if I'm thinking about the typical structure of the venture capital and private equity industry, that are related, that are investing in other sectors, in other industries. Okay, there are some key building blocks that are missing here for this ag space. Okay, which is even more an invitation to the companies operating in the space, so the startups as well as the VCs that are in the space, really to step up and raise the visibility and get on the front foot of being proactive with clear messages and bankable business models. Because it's important that they raise the visibility and go and grow as much as they can in a profitable way sooner rather than later. But there is more that needs to go in their hands with in terms of initiative, because there are some building blocks that are missing in this industry compared to others when it comes to the growth and the funding.
Could you give an example of what you consider to be a missing building block that's evident in other areas, but not in ag tech?
Well, look, I mean, if I'm looking at my old semiconductors and high tech days, when I was in venture capital and in investment banking, look, typically we could easily identify clusters of venture capital and private equity firms that were actually operating in the different stages. So is the seed, and then the first round, second round, third round, PIPO, and also pipes. Okay, these days, and in relation to the specific ag space, I find I can see the seed in the first round. I can see a little bit of private equity, but it's not really for that piece in the middle. And the reality is the pool of money is not as much compared to what I've seen in the classical tech industries and the various compartments, being software, hardware, whatever it is. Okay, yeah. But the reality is, to our advantage, we see a lot of family related money. Okay, family offices. Okay, so if these days private equity is around 4 or 5 trillion US dollar total amount of money, the money pot that is there, the family and the family offices area is these days around 8 to 9 trillion US dollar, largely unmapped. Okay, and compared to what we'd seen 10, 20 years ago in tech, high tech, these days we get a lot of sovereign wealth funds. Okay, so money is coming from Middle East, from Southeast Asia, so there is much more around, but it's more on the fringes. But if we're thinking about how we can help the startup, these early stage companies in the ag space, okay, they really need to think through what is their real value proposition, their overall purpose for being there, and getting towards a bankable business model in a sustainable way, almost with a design thinking type of mentality, but taking into account that it's a different world compared to other industries, but also what we've seen in the evolution of other industries that have actually boomed so much.
Right. It seems that, yeah, we're coming back a bit to this idea of the ecosystem. Mark, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I think Liana raises a good point about capital availability, especially when it comes to growth stage. I do know of a number of VCs that are now spreading their wings out from being only pure Series A, Series B in this space, and anticipating that there are going to be more growth rounds, and that's an underserved bracket. Likewise, you've got this other strange situation where you've got growth and Series A investors who are reaching backwards in the chain towards the seed stage because they need to get into the rounds very early. So you have this very odd situation. I think if I put a positive light on it from a startup perspective or a founder's perspective, what you're really looking at is a pioneer opportunity. So that means that the agri-food space, I don't think any of us 3 or 4 years ago sitting around this virtual table right now would have anticipated just how quickly alternative proteins would have taken off, for example. So you've got this kind of pioneer space that we're all working within, which is very exciting. And I think there are 2 ways that we can start to tie that space together in terms of pathways for startups to go. One of them is on the regulatory frameworks that we discussed a moment ago. If governments give clarity, it means that other actors, larger corporations, farmers across the value chain, producers, etc., can take action with confidence and lower risk. So that means that startups can also, when you're a founder, where your product market fit will bring you with your customers. Unfortunately, that's taking a bit long. So the second way to do it is through commercial application. And that's where you get a great example would be on alternative proteins, where you've basically said, right, a couple of large brands there have led that vision. Consumers have voted with their wallets, and that means that that retailers and the entire value chain have had to start listening and start applying that. And you've seen huge amounts of capital coming into the market off the back of that. So I do agree with Diana's point. I think if you compare us to other industries, the agri-food segment is still somewhat struggling to tie together all of these different growth points, but it's also because of where we are. There are not that many large exits that you can point to within the agri example that would give VCs or new LPs entering the space confidence, which is also, again, to a good point, that's why you see a lot more family offices working in space, because they've got the vision and the understanding of the industry to work to it. So I'm a bit more optimistic. I say give it time, a couple of years, we'll be very surprised about exactly what's come into play there. And you're well positioned today if you're a researcher thinking about starting a company in this space.
Thank you. Alize, you're in the business of brokering a lot of these partnerships. Could you comment a bit on what you see when these partnerships succeed?
It's true. We're trying to break, like, agriculture is so wide, and as mentioned, depending on what sub-industry we're talking about, it's more or less easy, and we're talking about different types of partnerships. But I was thinking again, I mean, the beauty of when you do have a B2C model and your customer kind of champions you with their purchasing power, it makes it much easier sometimes to kind of give way to more capital in that industry, versus where we've invested in it's very much B2B. It's very much what Edward was going back to, a lot of regulation. So talking about scale, there is a ceiling. And where we operate in emerging markets, what we've seen is when we really wanted to go to kind of a growth stage with the ventures we invested in, it suddenly meant investing in the whole value chain. So you have to internalize most of it, because it's non-existent by public services or by the existing infrastructure, which makes it kind of a deep pocket a sector which entails other types of players. But it's true that it's also a larger community of capital that is coming in. And we've worked also in the past a lot with many DFIs and international institutions that have as priority mandate climate change, and then hence a heavy investment on agriculture. And also, I think I mentioned quickly before, but education. A lot of what we hope we will be investing in ed tech will primarily be for agri-tech purposes, through the farmers or the communities, where we have to see a shift in the next generation, because a lot of these economies are dependent, but we're seeing that either the focus on the produce that they are currently on, or the methodology that they use, it won't sustain them for very long. Hence regenerative and land restoration, as mentioned before. So there's no quick answer, and it's a long process. It means, of course, the keyword that we've used today, building an ecosystem. It means building bridges, not being afraid to take on these kind of upfront costs that will have this long-term return on investment. And I think at SeedStars, what made us really accountable to the kind of what seems kind of vague talk and that we were putting forward on these subjects, we put in place our impact framework. And I think that it was also mentioned in the past, but that really helped us, even though very much of it is still a theory that we need to, through experimentation, prove, figure out what are also these metrics by sectors, looking at agricultures and the sub-industries that we support. How can we really be accountable to that scalability? And that has helped us also as investors to experiment on how best to be of support to these ventures, which differs according to their challenges.
Thank you. To close this part, Ahmad, could you comment on whether there's a comparative advantage of the CGIAR in offering pathways to scaling and commercialization in some sectors?
That's a big question. I think there's only one answer, and the answer is yes. There's a comparative advantage for the CGIAR. It's the only global consortium on agricultural research, period. We have no alternatives, really. And given its on-the-ground presence, given the depth of expertise over the past decades that it has, I don't think we can really do any better. So not only is it the only option, but it actually is a pretty good option, I'd say, as far as the investment from the public purse that we've had in this. Now, probably where we could do better as far as the CGIAR as a system is concerned is thinking of it as one system that is able to coordinate these kinds of needs internally. So if I think about it from my side, working at the foundation, or if I'm thinking about it as folks working in on a sort of center by center model as we have done historically. So if we could centralize or coordinate some of these functions and increase efficiencies to be able to navigate the thousands of researchers working within the system and the gazillions of innovations that they're driving, I think that'll be pretty significant. And so at the heart of it, that's probably its core comparative advantage, which is on the ground presence in a lot of geographies, very deep bench of expertise. The area where we probably need to strengthen is improve coordination of one system with the venture capital community and other sources of finance.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to be moving on to the third section of our forum, which is on the venture capital's role in impact. So in today's world, success isn't just about market share. As technologies and innovations are scaled and deployed and adopted, they also impact our desired outcomes for sustainable development. So the first question I have goes to Dorothy. How can we make sure to feature sustainable development goals centrally in the scaling of food and ag tech innovations?
I think that's a great question, because we speak about the SDG goals quite a bit when we create our strategies at Unilever, but they don't really come out any further and we don't really measure impact against them. So I think there's still quite a bit to be done to, for lack of a better word, commercialize the SDGs to be something that we're all collaboratively working toward. And I haven't seen that we're quite there yet. I think that they're referenced quite a bit in the NGO expert world, but when it really comes down to commercializing it and galvanizing efforts behind the SDGs, I can't say that I've seen enough effort and importance go to those conversations. I think a reason for that is because they are goals without kind of KPIs that are divided against the industry. So we can ladder up to certain SDGs, and we ladder up to quite a few of them, from the environment sector, of course, nature sector, malnutrition and nutrition advancement, and of course, partnerships. And we speak to them in a credible way, and when we're having those kind of higher level conversations, but they're not something that we're really actively creating consumer facing movements around. The first one that we participated in was recently with the Post-it notes around, saying, let's make a social media post with a post-it on the SDGs. We did it as part of Unilever's efforts and partnerships for the UN Food System Summit through the brands, but didn't really see a lot of traction through consumers. So I think there's still a conversation to be had about really building kind of unified, uniform ways of communicating about what needs to be done across the sector, so that we can build it up from, a demand perspective as well. So if we really want to move the needle, we have to build the consumer demand for foods that are grown in better ways, for foods that utilize technology and science, which a lot of those things consumers are quite afraid of. And a way to do that is to really put energy and effort toward an external, not branded commitment and goal. So I think there's an opportunity there for us to work together to try to see how we raise the importance of the SDGs, use them as something that is unbranded, to put across a variety of different companies and partnerships to say, this is what we're all investing in, and this is why, we should grow the demand of it. But I think there's also a lack of communication between a lot of the players and across the food system. And that, I think, is what is dividing us from, farming and doing agritech in a certain way, and then making it something that can be commercialized and something that people really want. And the way that will really shift the whole system is to make the most demanded products be the ones that are the best for the planet and for the future of our food. So I'm happy to collaborate further on it. I think there's a lot more work to be done for all of us in that space.
Thank you, Dorothy. Ahmad, I think as a program officer, you might also have something to say about the measuring impact against those sustainable development goals.
Sure. So I actually incidentally lead a portfolio of work focused on Sustainable Development Goal 2, the goal to end hunger, to try and coordinate other donors around its achievement, to identify what works, and then to scale up the finances. And then within that framework, we've been very focused on the targets 2.3 and 2.4. So those are the targets on productivity, income, and sustainability. So that's a lot of UN jargon to just lay out there very quickly. To me and to our team, they're very useful pivot points to work with other public funders. There's a high degree of consensus at the public, private, national, regional level on those targets and goals. But unfortunately, these goals are very siloed within a UN system. So it's really helpful to hear Dorothy speak to Unilever actually using or thinking about them. But to me, they are fundamentally a useful tool for probably public sector end interventions or coordination. This is not a way really to talk publicly in a market-facing way about things. So to me, the utility is having consensus on a target or goals. Their specificity is historically significant. In the history of agricultural development, we have never been this specific about targets or goals that we want to collectively achieve. That's a triumph. That's great. We have 10 years left, roughly, or less now, to achieve them. So, and we're already well behind. That's just a good reminder. But on the VC side, I really don't see how they're relevant in a public-facing way. However, if actors like the foundation or other public funders can come in and engage the private and VC community with this kind of specificity in terms of coherence, coordination on specific asks, I think we'll go a lot farther than we have before. So I'll pause there.
Thank you. Okay. So I want to move the topic a little bit more generally to challenges in scaling and adoption. I'll go first to Bruno. What kind of lessons can we learn from food and ag tech innovations that have already successfully been scaled?
Yeah, that's a great question and critical. My experience has been that if a technology works on the farm, it gets adopted quickly. And that's, for example, the presence of GPS mounted on tractor. We're still talking about, US-based system, nearly 90% or more, of the tractor, because it solved a significant problem, made the life of farmers easier, driving around, being more efficient in not longer overlaps of application or areas not covered. And what I am also seeing, though, is that farmers are very seldom engaged in the conversation, and so they are bombarded with technologies as each of the technology pretends to be the total solution to their problem, and it's far from being that. And farmers look, unfortunately, because of their busy schedule and the very thin line and risk that they face in terms of economics and risks, they want a turnkey solution. And it's really difficult to do that. And so I think anyone working in this field, whether it's a VC or again, scientists, we need to be fully aware of engaging with them, realizing, listening more rather than say, don't worry about, listen to me, this is going to work. He said, but I don't need it. Don't worry, it's going to work. That dialogue should not longer continue. And unfortunately, it still goes in that direction. So the suggestion again is making them part more of, if we really want adoption. And the other thing is in the context of carbon sequestration, for example, which is key for net zero and all that, we still have models where farmers bear all the risk, and despite of the technology. So there needs to be a little bit of an overall there in sharing the risk, and through the technology, they will be much more willing to adopt technologies if they see that someone else has a skin in the game.
Thanks. What about you as another a startup representative? what
Yeah,
exists? Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Bruno, that was perfect. That was exactly right. You know, we're definitely thinking about it in terms of how can we deliver products that actually make a grower money. That is, we have to be able to do this in a way that the grower doesn't have the risk, exactly as Bruno said. You know, how do we remove that? How do we make a product that moves us in the right direction? For us, it's carbon sequestration or the other things we're developing, but really in a way that it is the obvious solution because it's the most economic solution, and the grower has more likelihood of raising money. And I know I've talked to several growers who have said, look, we're going to come in here, but other people are going to take, you know, if we come in and save carbon and put that and improve our soils, but we're not going to get the value from it. And so we really focus on thinking about how do we make sure that growers retain the value of that product. And so focusing on the final customer.
Thank you. Question to our venture firm representatives, starting with Edward. What motivates venture capital firms to continue to support startups when new challenges are revealed by scaling or adoption?
Thank you. Before I answer this question, I just want to go back to this discussion on the STGs and whether or not they have a role in venture capital. And just make a comment on that. I think there is a role for STGs for some venture funds, but it depends on what that fund is, what the thesis of investment is, and who's running that fund and who the limited partners are. And one of the things which gives me a lot of faith about what we're seeing in agri-food tech in general is that there is a shift towards delivering on STGs. You know, we have people on planet in mind in all of our theses for building new companies at Deep Science Ventures. I shout out to Ocean delivering SDG 14 about conservation and sustainable economic use of ocean resources. But it all really depends on whether or not you have limited partners, those who have contributed funds to the fund itself, who are engaged in that, and that they're not just in it to make a capital return, they are looking at it in terms of future generations. Now, to your original question, what motivates VCs to help their companies when they're in trouble with adoption or scale up? I mean, I don't want to sweep it under the rug. Money is a factor there, right? Venture capitalists have an obligation to see a return and create a return on their fund and to support their companies. But to be perfectly honest with you, what I'm encouraged by in this space is that doesn't seem to come first. It's really a combination of things. It's a combination of the opportunity to learn how to tackle those specific issues, because a problem that one company is facing is going to be faced by another company in an analogous space. It's an opportunity to deploy historic expertise at the firm and learn from mistakes and do it right. But it's also, most importantly, an opportunity to help the people that are running that company. Right? When you're working with a company, you are building personal relationships with these founders, with the employees. You want to see success in their professional lives and their personal lives. And I guess a final piece here is that the implication here is that a scale-up challenge or an adoption challenge is a bad thing. And actually, I would see that as a good thing in the sense that it demonstrates that the company has moved from one stage to the next. And that's because a lot of companies, they particularly in food and biotech, they have to start with what you call intermediate products. At the beginning, you can only produce a certain amount, and you have to sell that small amount for a very high value. But as you grow your company and you enter into larger markets, you need to sell a lot more higher volume, lower value products. And the implication is that if you're getting to that and that's the challenge, then you're starting to hit the bigger market and you're going to have a greater return. And where does that take you? That takes you all the way to not being a startup anymore if you crack it, which means at that point you're a successful company. And if you have that, then that company with those great people can then address the next problem in the supply chain and think about how it makes more impact. So I'd say, yeah, a lot of that.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see, Alize, could you also comment on the same question from your experience? What motivates you?
I think for us, and not to go too far, I mean, that's what's cool about the job. Huh? It's in essence figuring out how we can solve the bigger challenges. So I think that's really the driver of being part of being part of the change. And we feel that where it's most exciting and fulfilling for us is helping at that seed stage of inception and creation and innovation and going along the journey with these entrepreneurs. Now we have to make it profitable because we have an obligation. We have to be accountable, not only financially, but also impact wise. And I think it's a conversation we're having not only from our LPs that are more and more driven by this conversation, but also by our talents. The teams are by default coming in with a very, very strong sense of purpose, and so it's a constant learning mechanism, because if we had, if we understood the rules of the games and what worked, we'd already be implementing this non-existent blueprint. So yeah, it's really being part of the adventure.
Thank you. Liana, could you comment on the same question from your perspective? What motivates investment to keep going when there are challenges in scaling?
Well, I mean, look, when we're looking at this wider ag space, okay, is clearly getting more and more on the radar screen, or venture capitalists and private equity houses, okay, and also corporates with a venture capital arm, okay. And that is clearly, there is an overall general sense of making a progression on these topics and contribute to the world and having an impact, okay, let alone the fact that these days there are also impact funds that have actually popped up, okay. So it is, and some of these players will want to seek alpha, okay, so they want to see returns vis-a-vis an investment that they actually made for themselves, but also for the LPs and for the overall formula, but also because at the end of the day, you've got to have bankable businesses that are up there, because that's the only way you're going to be feeding the machine and have a sustainable business and formula that keeps going, okay. One point that I'd like to make, it's in relation to the how the PEs and the venture capital funds are actually looking at this thing these days, okay. More and more on their radar screen. Some of them are actually setting up dedicated funds, or anyway shifting the way they're allocating the funds to be able to cater to this space, okay. There is a huge effort in terms of doing market mapping to see who's doing what and where the innovation is going, and how they can actually build the ecosystems proactively, because maybe the corporates cannot do it themselves, and also the startups cannot survive on their own. So some of these houses are actually getting out and creating, designing and bringing together and creating these ecosystems, okay. And when it comes to this, to ESG specifically, looking in the last 6 months, I did a lot with PEs, and I've seen that there is always this grid of this checklist that they need to go through when it comes to ESG. So very much there in terms of topic, but I think that it has not been well understood and appreciated, the cost of having ESG compliant businesses, and what is going to be the implication when it comes to the bottom line, or otherwise the other way around, what an investor and a corporate needs to do in order to design a business that is ESG compliant, and maybe taking a few shortcuts so they do not need actually to clean the businesses thereafter, but rather they need to choose, okay. Having said that, this has pricing implications. So I think that in general, the various investors have found a way to price in terms of deducting from the headline price some amount to make these businesses compliant, but it's not clear yet what is the price premium that should be associated to these businesses when it comes to the valuation and the pricing. So I think we've got to have another 6 to 12 months of running through investment committees, these investments, really to appreciate what it means from a due diligence perspective, from a compliance perspective, the overall impact on the bottom line. And then also what is going to mean in terms of pricing and valuations being put on the table.
Right. Thank you very much. So we're very near our end. So I'm going to just ask, maybe end on a positive note. Ennis, are there sort of any positive social environmental impacts that we've seen so far from collaborative food and ag tech innovations in public-private ventures?
It's a big question. I think we do have, a number of examples globally. I think actually maybe a different way to frame the question to get at maybe the heart of this is, what does it take to create these successful partnerships? And I think everyone today has touched on this a bit, but one of the things that I would challenge everyone to consider is it's one thing to know that we all have similar goals. And we often, from a business lens, say, do we have the same goal? If so, and we see the technology is viable, let's invest, let's bring this forward, we have a partnership. But another way to approach this, and I think is often missed, is do we have the same assumptions about how change occurs? Mm-hmm. And really, I think it's important for us to recognize that whether it's us individually or the companies we represent or support, we all have different views on what we think will require, what's required in order to enable change. And it's not going to be one thing, right? So I think it's important for us to understand when we look at ways to partner, that we also understand how to partner with those who actually bring additive assumptions about change to the table so that we can think through the more exciting ways that we can partner. And what I mean by that is some of us will approach this from the system and ecosystem lens that's been talked about today. Some might approach this from how do we engage consumers? That's also been mentioned. Others might look at this from the behavioral science that's required for consumers to adopt certain types of products or technologies. And the reality is we need all these things. So as we partner, it's not enough to just be aligned to the same goals. We also need to be aligned to the different ways that we can bring about that change.
Anastasia, could I ask you to also speak from your experience on the social and environmental impacts that you've seen in some of your successful partnerships?
Okay, I think that this goes back a bit from my point of view to what we were discussing before about the SDGs, because for us as scientists, it was important to have some goals to work on, okay? And we really are working on this. So we have these goals and we see them from the technical point of view. So what kind of technologies we can build to follow these goals? Because in general, I see that the goals, they don't talk about technologies, they don't consider so much the technologies that they are there, but we are working on this. And now an important thing is that I see companies that they approach us and they say, okay, following this goal, we are talking now about the SDG 2, but I think this is more vertical to the other SDGs also. And they say, okay, we want to follow also this goal for ourselves to be more sustainable. Also because I think this is also this discussion about companies that they shouldn't pollute. And also there's the discussion that companies may start having to pay some taxes if they are not sustainable in the future, no? So following this discussion, we follow the same goal. So I think that what is happening now is that we put all together our efforts to bring out something more green, more sustainable. And from my point of view, as I said, the SDGs helped a lot. I know that there is still a lot of work that needs to be done, but it's helping because it gives us some targets and it helps us to also ourselves to understand what kind of technologies we have to bring front to follow these goals.
Thank you, Nasia. Okay, so regretfully, we are almost at the end of our time together. If one big thing that I'm kind of taking away from this discussion is that agri-food tech funding is a huge ecosystem that is actually under construction and is probably going to change quite a bit over the next few years. And the other thing that I really take away is that for the researchers and scientists in the room to really think about how to make the connections, because they are not obvious connections to make, and you have to actively participate in this ecosystem to get your ideas and vision out there into the market. I would like to thank the panel for an incredibly rich discussion. I hope our time together will seed many conversations to follow and encourage others to reach out from their own tribes and find inspiration and direction at these same interfaces. We at the Alliance and CGIAR are committed to these interfaces, And we've recently launched the Accelerate for Impact platform, where we aim to bridge science and entrepreneurship and to provide support to visionary teams at the cutting edge of food systems to bring them their ideas to market. Up next, we're going to be announcing the winners of the Innovation Challenge Awards and hosting our closing remarks. So thank you everybody very much for your attention and thoughtful participation. If you are a speaker, please stay on the Zoom for pictures for 30 seconds. And for the audience, please stay tuned and we will see you in about 30 seconds. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.